The carriage came on a Tuesday, in the third week of November, when the elms along the Ashwick Drive had given up their last leaves, and the sky pressed down on the Derbyshire hills like a closed hand. Dorothea Vale had been at the window of the estate office when she saw it. A plain hired carriage, no livery, no crest, one trunk lashed to the back, and she had felt, rather than thought, that something in the house was about to shift. She had learned to trust that feeling. In 3 years of managing the Ashwick Hall accounts on behalf of the Marlowe household, the feeling had never been wrong. She straightened her cuffs, closed the ledger she had been reconciling, and went to receive him. He was already in the entrance hall when she came down the main stair. He was taller than she had expected. She did not know why she had expected anything. With dark hair cut short and a plain dark coat that was good wool but carried no decoration. He held a leather satchel in one hand and his hat in the other, and he was looking not at the door he had come through, but up the staircase to the portrait gallery above, with an expression she could not name. It was not the appraisal of a man assessing property. It was something older and quieter than that. She had seen that expression once on a man returning to a house after a long illness, standing in his own corridor as if testing whether it still knew him. Then he looked at her, and the expression was gone. "Miss Vale?" he said. Not a question. He had been told her name. "Mr. Farlow," she said, because that was the name given in the letter from the London firm of Crane and Ashby. They were here, the letter had explained, on behalf of a creditor with a claim against the Ashwick estate. Mr. Farlow was their agent. He would require access to the accounts. She said, "We have made a room ready in the east wing. I will show you to it when you like." He looked at the staircase once more. The line of his jaw was set, not in displeasure, but in the particular stillness of a man holding himself very carefully in place. Then he looked at her. "The accounts first," he said. His voice was low and level. "If you don't object." It was Lady Harriet Marlowe who objected. Dorothea heard it from the corridor outside the drawing room that evening when she was returning a set of keys to their cabinet by the main stair. Lady Harriet's voice carrying through the half-open door, speaking to her husband in the particular clipped register she reserved for matters she found tiresome. "Cassian, they have sent a man, and Cassian's useful girl has already given him the ledger room. I do not wish to have a creditor's agent underfoot for a week. Manage it." His reply was too low to hear. Dorothea did not stop to try. She placed the keys in the cabinet, closed it, and continued down the corridor toward the estate office, where the fire she had banked before dinner would still be warm. She had been Cassian's useful girl for 3 years. She had been useful in other houses before that, and in other ways before those houses. And somewhere along the years of being useful, she had learned to make of herself a very small and quiet thing. Not invisible exactly, but below the threshold of attention, like a side table or a well-oiled door. People did not see what they did not need to see. She had stopped asking to be seen. The estate office was the one room in Ashwick Hall that felt entirely hers. The Marlowes had not interested themselves in the management of the land. Cassian was a man of fashion and London habits. Lady Harriet a woman whose attentions were entirely consumed by position and appearance, and so the work of the estate had descended to Dorothea almost by accident, and she had taken it up with the thoroughness she gave to everything. She understood now the Derbyshire fields in every season. She understood the tenants' names, the state of their cottages, the particular history of each boundary dispute and drainage problem. She had written 600 letters on behalf of the Ashwick estate in 3 years, and every one of them had gone out under Cassian's signature. She did not mind. The signature was a formality, The work was hers. She sat down at the desk, opened the rent book, and did not think about the hired carriage with no livery, or the man who had looked up the staircase as though counting steps he already knew. He came to the estate office at 8 in the morning. She had been there since 7. She had laid out the ledgers she thought he would want, the rent accounts for the past 5 years, the estate expenditure books, the outstanding debt schedule she had compiled herself against the eventuality of exactly this kind of inquiry. She was nothing if not prepared. Mr. Farlow came through the door, removed his coat, hung it on the peg behind the door as though he knew it was there, and sat in the chair across the desk without being invited. He opened the rent book she had left at the top of the stack and turned the pages with a deliberateness that was not hasty and not slow, reading rather than skimming. And he did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said, "You numbered the tenant's holdings by the old survey marks." She looked at him. "Yes, it is the most reliable system. The new maps are inconsistent," he said. "The old survey was done in 1801. A pause. That was before Marlowe's tenure. Before his administration of the estate, yes? She kept her voice careful. He was appointed to oversee affairs in the 7th Earl's absence. He did not look up from the page. The 7th Earl, who has been missing since 1815. Who is believed to have died in the peninsula. Yes. He turned another page. Then, without particular emphasis, he said, "What do you know about the Ashwick drainage problem on the lower East Fields?" She told him. She told him about the flooding in the 3rd year and the tile work she had arranged at cost from the home farm budget, and the yield improvement the following season, and the letter she had written to the Board of Agriculture that had gone unanswered. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The problem was there when the previous Earl died. The field was waterlogged at his funeral." She looked at him again. "That is a very particular thing to know," she said. He met her eyes, and there was something in his face, a decision being made and then made against. "I read a great many estate records," he said. He was not lying exactly. She could feel it, the space between what he said and what he meant. She had been reading spaces like that for 3 years, and she had nothing to put into it, no name for what she was reading, and so she returned to the ledger and showed him the drainage costs, line by line, and if her hand was not entirely steady, she folded it in her lap where he could not see it. There was a moment, early in the 2nd afternoon, when she reached across the desk for the expenditure book, and her hand brushed the arm of the chair where he had set his coat. Something fell. She heard the small metallic sound before she saw it, a coin-shaped disc rolling across the floorboards, catching the firelight, coming to rest against the leg of the desk. She picked it up before he could reach it. It was silver, worn smooth on the edges, smaller than a shilling. On its face was stamped a device she recognized, the Ashwick crest, the hawk with spread wings, the 3 stars beneath. The same crest that was carved above the hall doorway and embroidered on the chair backs in the dining room and tooled into the bindings of the oldest books in the library. She turned it over. On the back, in very small letters, R. A. 1803. She held it out to him. He took it from her palm, his fingers closing around it without quite touching hers, and put it in his waistcoat pocket. "A family heirloom?" she asked. "A reminder," he said. He did not explain of what. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly professional, and then she looked back at the ledger. And the fire popped quietly in the grate, and the afternoon rain began against the estate office window. And neither of them spoke of the token again. If you have ever watched a man pretend not to know something he knows in his bones, stay with this story, because what follows is the account of a house learning to recognize itself. The tenant eviction came on a Thursday. Dorothea had known about it since Monday, when she had found Cassian's note to the land agent tucked into the wrong file on the estate desk, whether by carelessness or by some expectation that she would see it and say nothing, she could not determine. Old Mr. Fenwick, 73 years old, 40 years on the Ashwick North pasture, 3 months behind on rent since his son had gone to Manchester for work and not yet sent money back. She had written to Cassian. She had proposed the arrears be carried forward against the son's anticipated return. She had received no reply. On Thursday morning, she went to the North pasture herself. The land agent's cart was already at the cottage gate. Mr. Fenwick stood in his doorway, a small, weathered man who had worked this land since the previous Earl was alive, and his face had the particular blank steadiness of a man who has already given up the argument, but has not yet given up his feet. Beside him, clutching his coat sleeve, was his granddaughter. She was perhaps 7 years old. She wore a blue kerchief around her neck, tied in the way of the local women. And she was not crying, which was somehow worse. Dorothea spoke to the land agent for 4 minutes. She cited the estate's code of practice, which she had herself compiled 2 years prior. She cited the arrears schedule, which she had written, and the provision she had inserted for temporary carry forward in cases of demonstrated hardship. She cited the fact that the provision had been approved, in writing, by Cassian in the autumn of the preceding year, when he had signed the document she put before him without reading it and gone back to his newspaper. The land agent turned the provision over in his hands. He looked at it, and then he looked at her, with the expression of a man who has just understood that he was about to make a significant error, and was grateful, in a terse way, to have been stopped. The cart left. Mr. Fenwick sat down rather suddenly on his own doorstep. The little girl with the blue kerchief looked at Dorothea for a long moment, then took her grandfather's hand and pressed her face briefly against his sleeve, and was quiet. Dorothea turned and walked back along the edge of the north pasture toward the hall. The November air was sharp and smelled of cold earth and coming frost, and her shoes were not adequate to the mud along the field wall, and she did not care about either of those things. She was thinking about Cassian's note, and the space between his signature and any actual concern for what it was he had signed, and she was thinking, as she often did, of the distance between the names in a rent book and the people who lived inside those names. She did not see, until she had almost reached the stile, that Mr. Farlow was standing at the field wall. He had not been there when she went out. He was there now, with his coat collar turned up against the November cold, and he was watching her with an expression she had no practice reading because no one had ever directed it at her. Not pity, not approval, something quieter and more costly than either. The kind of look that says, "I have been watching, and what I've seen is not what I was told to expect, and I am rearranging accordingly." When she reached the stile, he said, "How long have you been doing that?" "Doing what?" "Protecting them," he said, "when no one is paying you to." She looked away, over the pasture. The little girl and her grandfather were still on the doorstep, the blue kerchief a small flag of color against the gray. Someone has to know the people who work this land. If not, they become entries in a rent book. He was quiet. Then, very low, he said, "Yes, they do." She did not look at him again, and as she stepped over the stile and turned toward the hall, she was aware of the exact distance between them. 4 feet, no more, and the cold air between them, and the way his voice had gone when he said those 3 words, like someone naming something that had cost him a great deal to understand. Her pulse did something she had told it, firmly, not to do. It did it anyway. That evening, Emmett, the head groom, led him to the gallery. Dorothea did not know this. She was in the estate office, writing her response to an inquiry from a neighboring estate about the sheep rotation when Emmet, who had been at Ashwick Hall since before the 7th Earl was born, who had known his father and his father's father, and who had looked at Mr. Farlow on the first evening with the expression of a man seeing a figure he had believed to be a ghost, put his hand on the younger man's arm at the back staircase, and said very quietly, "Come with me, my lord." He came. In the gallery, the candles were low. The portrait of the late Countess hung on the west wall, where Dorothea had quietly had it rehung 3 months prior, after Lady Harriet had sent it to the attic on the grounds that the frame was unfashionable. The Countess looked out from the painting with the serious, composed expression that ran through the Ashwick line. Dark eyes, a fine jaw, a quality of contained attention that was not coldness, but its better cousin. The attention of someone who chose to be present. He stood before it for a long time. His hands were at his sides. He had the stillness of a man who has been holding something in his chest for so long that putting it down, in this room, in front of this face, required the entirety of his concentration. When he spoke, his voice was even, but Emmet, who had known him since he was 4 years old, heard everything under it. "She died before I came back," he said. It was not a question. 2 years after the news from Spain, my lord, Emmet said. He said nothing further. He understood, as the old staff of such houses understand, that the moment required only witness. He had been in Spain. He had not been dead in Spain, but he had been close enough to it that the distinction had seemed, for a long time, to matter very little. He had been in a military hospital in Badajoz, and then he had been in a farm in the Alentejo that the woman who found him had kept, and when he could walk again, he had written to his father, and the letter had not been answered. When he found passage to England and wrote again, the solicitors had replied that the Earl of Ashwick was deceased, and that the estate was in the administration of Mr. Cassian Marlowe, his nearest male relative, as the 7th Earl had died without confirmation of an heir. He had understood, then, that his father had declined to acknowledge him. He had understood that the argument of 1813, the refusal of the match his father had arranged, the raised voices in the library, the words that had never been taken back on either side, had been made permanent by the absence of any reply. His father had let the silence stand, and then his father had died, and the silence had become the estate's official record, and the record had become fact, and the fact had been administered for 7 years by a man who genuinely believed the heir was dead. He had believed himself already dead to the house. He had believed it for 7 years. He put his hand briefly against the frame of the portrait. The gilding was warm under his fingers, the way old gold is warm, not from recent touching, but from some quality of the metal itself that holds the years it has sat in a room. What she had not known was that the fields she had managed, the tenants she had protected, the letters she had written, and the drainage tile she had laid, and the provisions she had inserted into documents Cassian signed without reading, all of it had been done for land that was his fields, his tenants, his house, and she had kept it, because someone had to, for a man she had never met, who was standing 3 floors above her in the gallery, looking at his mother's portrait. With his hand at the gilded frame and a gaming token in his waistcoat pocket that his father had given him when he was 10 years old, on a morning in this house, before any of it went wrong. He came downstairs an hour later. He knocked on the estate office door, and she said, "Come in," and he sat across from her again, and they worked on the boundary survey until the fire died, and she lit a second candle. And still he did not go, and she did not ask him to. They spoke less than they might have. The work was sufficient occupation. and the firelight was easier than explanation. And she had the sense, which she did not examine closely, of something being held in suspension between them. Something patient, like water behind a lock. Lady Harriet Marlowe announced the dinner party on a Friday. It was to celebrate, she said, the engagement of her niece, Sophronia Cresswell, to Sir Edmund Braith, of Braith Park, in Nottinghamshire, and it was to be a respectable occasion. 12 guests at the long table, the good candelabra, a proper dinner in 4 courses. She said nothing to Dorothea about any of this directly. She said it to Cassian in the morning room, and Dorothea heard it from the housekeeper, who heard it from the lady's maid. Dorothea was asked to arrange the flowers and the seating card placement and to ensure the silver was properly cleaned, and was told she would eat in the kitchen. She heard it again on the Saturday evening, this time from the footman who had been sent to the linen cupboard for the good tablecloths, and who paused in the corridor to tell her what he had overheard. Lady Harriet had been speaking to Miss Sophronia in the drawing-room. She had been explaining, in her particular clipped way, how the household ran, and who ran it, and what position each person occupied. "The girl in the estate office keeps the books," Lady Harriet had said. "She is very useful. Cassian could not manage without her. She is simply a useful girl. You must not mistake her for anything else." Sophronia Cresswell had laughed, not cruelly, simply as young women laugh when they have been told where the lower boundary of a class falls and wish to show they understand the map. Dorothea thanked the footman. She finished the seating cards. She went to the estate office and sat down. She had been told, in various ways and in various rooms, what she was, since the age of 17. She had become very good at receiving the information without flinching. There was something about hearing it relayed through the mouth of a man who had been in this house for a week, who had sat across from her in the firelight reading her ledgers, who had stood at the north pasture stile and asked how long she had been protecting people without being paid to, something about knowing that he had heard it too, that he knew, now, the precise category into which this house had filed her, that he had spent 6 evenings in her company, and now knew the exact dimensions of the box the Marlowes had built around her and labeled useful. She put away the seating cards. She began composing a letter to a household in Bath that had written in September, asking for a reference. She had not answered them in September. She had told herself she was comfortable at Ashwick. She answered them now. She was still at the desk at 10 o'clock that night, when she heard voices in the courtyard below the estate office window. She had not meant to listen. The window was old, and its fit imperfect, and the courtyard below was quiet, and the voices were distinct in the cold air. Emmett's first, low and urgent, and then his voice. His actual voice. Not the careful voice he had been using in the estate office, but the voice of a man speaking without a mask on. "My lord, it cannot wait longer." Then his voice came again. "I have what I need. The solicitors have the deposition. I will be gone by morning." She did not move for a long time after the footsteps receded. She had what she needed, too. She had the letter to Bath, and the knowledge that she had, for 7 days, been the useful girl not only to the Marlowes, but to a stranger with a debt collector's satchel who had walked through her ledgers gathering his inheritance while she held a lantern. She had been instrumental. She had been the useful girl one more time, in one more room, for one more person who had not thought to tell her the truth. Her hands were very still on the desk. She folded the letter to Bath and sealed it. The dinner was at 7 on a Monday. Dorothea spent the day on the estate accounts in the office, and did not come to the hall until the silver service was being laid, and then only to confirm with the housekeeper that the placements were correct. She had been told she would eat in the kitchen. She went to the kitchen and ate bread and cold meat beside the range, where the fire was warm and the smell of the evening's dinner still hung in the air, roast and spiced wine and something sweet from the pastry oven, and she told herself she was comfortable, and the telling was harder than it had been the week before. The guests arrived at 6:30. She heard the carriages. She heard the doors. She heard the swell of voices in the entrance hall, and the particular sound a gathering makes when it is settling into its own importance. She heard Lady Harriet's voice carrying over it all with the confident ease of a woman who has never once questioned her own right to be the center of any room. She was on her way back upstairs, carrying a small box of correspondence she had promised to file before the morning, when the front door opened again. She was at the turn of the back stair. She could see the entrance hall below through the inner window, the slice of it where the chandelier threw its best light, where Cassian stood receiving his guests in his good blue coat, where Lady Harriet was moving among the assembled company with a smile that she had spent decades calibrating to the exact temperature of gracious authority. She could see when the door opened. She could see him come in. He had dressed, as he had been dressing for a week, in plain dark clothes with no ornamentation. He carried himself differently than he had when she received him in this hall as a creditor's agent. He had been carrying himself differently for several days, in fact, since the evening after the gallery and Emmett's voice in the courtyard, and she had noticed it and filed it alongside the gaming token and the boundary marks and all the other things she had noticed and declined to name. He stopped inside the doorway. Cassian Marlowe turned, saw him, and went quite still. Lady Harriet turned a moment later. Her smile did not fall. She was too practiced for that, but it altered. The temperature of it dropped by several degrees. Her fan, which had been moving in a steady, slow measure, stopped. He said, clearly enough that the nearest cluster of guests could hear it without leaning in. "Good evening. I apologize for arriving without invitation. My name is Richard Ashwick. I am the Earl of Ashwick, and this is my house." The entrance hall did something that rooms rarely do outside of novels. It held its breath. Cassian said, "That is not, you cannot." He stopped. He looked at the man's face. He looked at his face for a long moment, the way a person looks when a landscape that should be unfamiliar is resolving unwillingly into something they have seen before. He said finally, in a voice entirely emptied of its usual confidence, "Richard." "Cassian," Richard said. Lady Harriet's fan was fully still. Beside her, Miss Sophronia Cresswell looked from the Earl to her uncle, and back to the Earl with the expression of a young woman whose evening has become something considerably more significant than a dinner party. Along the far wall, 3 of the assembled guests had drawn slightly together, the way people do in rooms where something is happening that they understand they will be asked about later. Dorothea had not moved. She was still on the back stair, her box of correspondence in her arms, her heart doing something it had not done in years, not the quiet, persistent flutter she had learned to ignore in the estate office, but something with more weight to it, something that pressed against her ribs from the inside. He was real. He had always been real. The questions that were too intimate, the boundary marks of the 1801 survey, the drainage field he knew without being told, the gaming token with his initials pressed into the silver, all of it had been real. And she had known it somewhere below the level of knowing. And she had let herself be too frightened, or too well trained in not asking for what she wanted, to name it. She watched him look around the entrance hall. She watched him find her. She did not know how he could see her in the shadow of the back stair, with a dozen well-dressed guests between them and the chandelier's light falling elsewhere. He looked directly at the inner window, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he had always known exactly where she was in any room. He crossed the entrance hall. The guests parted. Not because he asked them to, but because there was something in his manner that simply moved the air around him, and people stepped aside before they had quite decided to. Lady Harriet said something. He did not pause. Cassian said something else. He did not pause for that either. He stopped at the foot of the back stair. She came down 2 steps. She could not have said why. Her feet had managed it before her mind gave permission. He was very close. The box of correspondence was between them, which was perhaps the only reason she did not put her hand out. She could feel in her palms the wanting to. Lady Harriet said, from across the hall, in a voice she was working hard to keep steady, "She is simply the estate manager's girl, my lord. A useful sort of person. She has no place." He turned his head. Just his head. He looked at Lady Harriet Marlowe with the expression of a man who has decided something and is not open to revision. He said, "Her name is Miss Vale. She is my betrothed." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room the way water fills a glass, entirely, and without haste. Dorothea's hands had closed around the edges of the correspondence box so tightly she felt the corners against her palms. Lady Harriet's fan was now fully still. Cassian had sat down, not precisely in a chair, but against the wall, with the expression of a man for whom the evening has substantially exceeded its original terms. Miss Sophronia Cresswell, to her credit, looked at Dorothea with something that was almost recognition. The look of a young woman recalibrating who, in this room, it was worth attending to. And then looked away. One of the guests, an older woman near the far door, said, very quietly, "Well," and then said nothing further. Dorothea looked at him. He looked at her with the open, unguarded expression she had seen only in flashes across the past week, at the North Pasture Stile, at the estate desk at midnight, in the moment when she had held out the gaming token and his hand had almost touched hers. There was no mask left in it. There was only the thing underneath, which was plainer and more certain, and considerably more frightening than she had been prepared for. "I should have told you sooner," he said, just to her, as though the hall were empty. "I was afraid of what it would mean if I did," she said, because she had always been a person who chose the true word over the easy one. "You were afraid I would send you away." "Yes," he said. She thought of the letter to Bath, folded and sealed on the estate desk. She thought of 3 years of useful girl. She thought of the way she had felt at the North Pasture Stile when he had asked how long she had been protecting them, and she had looked away over the pasture because looking at him was too much to manage safely. She said, "I would not have sent you away." He reached into his waistcoat pocket. He placed the silver gaming token in her hand, his fingers closing briefly around hers, warm and certain, and then releasing. She held it. The hawk on the face of it. The 3 stars, R.A. 1803. He had been given this at 10 years old by a father who had not known how to say the things that mattered, and so had given a small silver disc instead. He had carried it to the peninsula and back. He had carried it into this house under a false name, and she had picked it up off the floor of the estate office and handed it back to him. And he had looked at her afterward with an expression she had not had the courage to name until she was standing on the back stair watching him cross a room full of people to reach her. She looked up at him. "Take me to the gallery," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked together through the entrance hall, past Cassian against his wall, and Lady Harriet with her stilled fan, and the 12 guests who had arrived for a dinner party and received something else entirely, and up the main staircase, and neither of them looked back. The gallery was quiet and cold. The candles were unlit. Enough moonlight came through the long windows that the portraits resolved out of the dark. The generations of Ashwick Earls, the women who had stood beside them, the children who had stood in front of them with the composed expression of people who expected the future to make room. At the far end of the west wall, in the frame Dorothea had ordered quietly restored 3 months prior, the late Countess looked out from her portrait with her dark eyes and her serious mouth. He stopped in front of her. He was very still. "She knew," he said after a long moment. "She always knew I would come back. She said so, in the last letter she sent to Spain. I did not receive it until a year after she had sent it. And by then—" He stopped. Dorothea stood beside him and looked at the portrait. The late Countess had a quality of patience in her painted face, the patience of a woman who has known the difference between delay and loss, and has never confused the two. "She looks like someone who was right a great deal of the time," Dorothea said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She had never heard him laugh. She filed it carefully, like a survey mark. "She was," he said. He looked at Dorothea. In the moonlight from the gallery windows, his face was exactly as it had been across every estate desk and field wall and firelit evening of the past week. The jaw she had privately called carved stone. The gray eyes she had no better name for than serious. The expression that she had been reading for 7 days without being certain she was reading it correctly. She was certain now. She held the gaming token between 2 fingers and turned it over in the light. R.A. 1803. The Hawk, the 3 stars. "When were you going to tell me?" she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "I had it planned. A proper conversation." A beat. "It would have gone nothing like that." "No," she agreed. "Considerably less interesting." He looked at the portrait once more, briefly, as if completing a conversation he had begun alone in this room without her. Then he looked back at her, and his hand came up, and very carefully, as though she were something he was not yet certain he had the right to, he covered her hand with his, the hand that held the token, and she felt, through the palm of her glove, the warmth of him, steady and patient and very certain. She turned her hand over. She held his. Outside the gallery windows, the November stars had come out over the Derbyshire hills, cold and bright and entirely indifferent to the interior drama of Ashwick Hall. Below, in the entrance hall, the evening's guests would be dispersing or deciding to stay. She suspected several would decide to stay. In the way that people do when they understand that what they have witnessed is something they will describe for the next 20 years. Cassian would be speaking with the solicitors. She had no doubt Richard had already notified. Lady Harriet would be managing, with considerable effort, the recalibration of every calculation she had made for the past 7 years. None of that was in the gallery. In the gallery, there was only the moonlight and the portraits and the Countess looking out from the west wall, and Richard Ashwick standing at the end of 7 years of believing himself already erased, holding the hand of the woman who had kept his house in order for 3 years without knowing it was his, and a small silver token between their palms stamped with the Ashwick crest, warm now from 2 sets of hands. He had come back as a stranger to his own land. He had walked through every field and sitting room and ledger page of it in disguise, and what he had found, in the estate office at a plain desk, was a woman who had already known the land better than he did, who had defended it, penny by penny and tenant by tenant, as though it mattered not because it was great, but because the people on it were real. She had not been protecting it for him. She had not known about him. She had been protecting it because someone had to. And she was someone. He understood as he stood in the gallery with her hand in his, that this was the thing about her he had been trying to name across all the ledger-lit evenings of the past week. It was not that she was capable. It was not that she was principled. It was that she had never once waited to be asked permission before doing what the land and the people on it required. He would not make her wait any longer than necessary. Downstairs, the solicitor's document naming him the 7th Earl of Ashwick was already in Cassian's hands. It would resolve the legal question with the efficient finality of things that have been properly prepared. By morning, the house would know who it belonged to. By the new year, the papers would be in order. By spring, the North Pasture tenant would have his arrears formally carried and forgiven. And the drainage tile would be inspected. And the letters she had written for 3 years under someone else's signature would begin going out under her own. But that was morning. That was spring. Tonight the gallery was quiet. The moonlight was silver on the old floors. The Countess looked out from her portrait with her dark, composed eyes, and Dorothea Vale stood in the house she had kept without knowing why, holding the hand of the man who had come back to it, and the gaming token was warm between their palms, and outside the long windows the stars burned steadily over the Derbyshire hills in all the cold and indifferent and beautiful November dark. She leaned, very slightly, into his arm. He did not say anything. He put his free hand over hers, briefly, with care, and then was still. He simply remained. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. If her story found something in you tonight, leave a thought below. And thank you, truly, for staying until the end.